Wanted to welcome 4156, one of the co-founders of Nouns DAO. This week, there's been a lot of discussion around the Nouniverse with hints that the official Nouns Discord may be shut down. A lot of questions coming in about this, and we thought it would be awesome and very helpful to get the information straight from the deep-fried horse's mouth, as it were. And so, without further ado, welcome 4156 to talk to us about that today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
For starters, some might think that this is sort of coming out of the blue, but it's not really. It's something you've been thinking about a lot and even talking about for a long time. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's lots of kind of context for these discussions, and you know, part of the context for these discussions is that a lot of discussions in the Nouns universe happen in private, which leads to scenarios like this where things kind of appear to be coming out of the blue. Almost immediately after we launched the project, there was some kind of like internal debate among the Nounders as to whether there was such a thing as a kind of official Nouns Discord. And we actually ended up kind of like changing the name of the Discord from Nouns to Nounders to Nouns on a few separate occasions. And so, you know, I think the origins of this conversation are that Nouns is, I think, much more kind of sensical as a protocol than an organization. And in this context, it's as sensical to have an official Nouns Discord as it is to have like an official Bitcoin or Ethereum Discord, right? I think in hindsight, I wish we would have called it the Nounders Discord, and I think that would have given us a lot more discretion to kind of curate what went on in there. But, you know, in the context of what it's become, I think there are lots of kind of different and fairly subtle reasons that it makes sense to end it now. And happy to get into those as well.
Can you expand a little bit on the difference between a protocol and an organization?
I would say probably the two defining features for Nouns that make it more like a protocol than an organization are, one, that it's kind of completely flat, right? There's no boss. There's a bunch of different stakeholders and different kinds of stakeholders. And then I think the other feature that makes it a protocol is that it's permissionless. So I think probably the permissionlessness is the most important property of kind of protocolness as it pertains to the Discord discussion, because it doesn't make sense to have an organization where you can't control who the members are, who the participants are, and then also to create a kind of organizational structure where you're forced to work with the people, or not forced, I'll say coerced to work with the people that you had no hand in choosing to work with. So that's where kind of the structure of the Discord that looks a bit more like something that's designed for an organization meets the structure of the project that is designed to be much more of a protocol. And then there's some kind of friction that emerges at that meeting place.
You had another tweet about how the official Nouns Discord is like a subsidization of vibes. What do you mean by the Discord subsidizing vibes?
I think a lot of the kind of arguments against deleting the Discord are that people love it there. It's a great space. It's a fun space, which I fully agree with. I don't disagree with that at all. And I think there's a sense in which it's a shame to lose that. But the fact remains that the reason it is that way is that, you know, there's a bunch of people that are putting in a bunch of work to make it that way. And I think that work that is done has these sort of like unintended consequences, right? Like subsidies always have these kinds of negative externalities, this kind of like fallout that is typically like much more nuanced than the thing that's being subsidized. For example, you could say, oh, let's all put like ethanol in our cars, and everyone's like, oh, that's great, corn is so green. And you know, you can make this very easy argument that that's a great thing to do, but all the way down the line now there's someone in a country halfway around the world who can't afford to eat because you're putting corn in your gas tank or whatever. I think the vibes that are created in that space kind of come at a cost, and that cost is having a marketplace for vibes, right? A marketplace for vibes where people can compete to create spaces that are kind of much more varied and diverse and interesting, and importantly, give power to the cultural creators in the ecosystem. And I think that is one of the things that we're currently subsidizing.
Okay, and then following on to that, you mentioned as well that the problem with subsidies is that the benefits are always less nuanced than the costs. That's a direct quote from your tweet as well. What do you mean by that?
So in this case, again, the benefits are very obvious. The benefits are the vibes, but I think you have to ask the question, like, what are the costs? And the costs are that like creating a space sort of creates these sort of subtle perverse incentives, right? Like, so you have this place that's called the official one, right? It's the official Discord of the protocol, and people feel compelled to be in there because it's official. But one of the problems is that it's Discord, and there's kind of no attention meritocracy like on Twitter or Farcaster, where typically the people with the most useful things to say get the most attention. And of course, if you don't like what they have to say, you can unfollow them. You can't unfollow people in Discord. So you have this space that you're kind of compelling everyone to be in, again, in the context of a permissionless organization where you can't choose who's in there. And in this space, you can't unfollow anyone. So you create the space where really like the loudest and the most kind of argumentative people who don't have a platform elsewhere are kind of able to thrive. And there's a sense in which you're kind of like feeding the reasonable people to the unreasonable ones because you're forcing them all to be in there. And so I think that's just one of the kind of subtle issues that you create when you have this official space.
41, we've had a lot of folks in the community sort of scared, for lack of a better term, sort of saying, where will we congregate? Where will we be able to find other builders? How will we find friends in the Nouniverse? What would you say to those people who are nervous about this impending closure of the Discord?
One, I would say that it's just a Discord server. Like if the project kind of can't survive us killing a Discord server, then it probably doesn't deserve to survive, right? Like there are people in the world, including some people in this room, that are like facing actual risks and hardship at the moment. And, we shouldn't kind of lose sight of how kind of minimal the risk of experimentation is here, even given a sort of like 50-50 uncertainty. And, I think the probability is much greater than that this works out very well. But even given like a 50-50 uncertainty, the kind of cost of experimentation in this context is so low that it does make sense to experiment. I guess to more directly address your question, like I think markets are very good and networks are very good. And, there's a lot of very smart people in this space who care. And I think in the absence of providing people with the space to meet, they're going to find their own spaces to meet and interesting things are going to happen there. And I think that's the whole reason to do it, right? Like if we kind of like hinted that we wanted to move in this direction and like no one said anything and there was no pushback, everyone like it was just a silence and everyone's like, okay, the project's dead. I think that would be one thing. That would be a compelling reason to not shut it down. But the fact that everyone cares so much, I think, is evidence that they are going to get together and find new ways to communicate, which is exactly what we want. And I think it's going to produce a lot of very interesting and fruitful outcomes in the long run.
I've had that same thought because I think a lot of NFT projects, if they killed the Discord, they'd kill the project, to be quite honest, because a lot of them are really dependent on that centralized source of truth. But you haven't seen that seem to be the case after these announcements. So instead, people are creating new Discords. They're inviting people to new Discords a mile a minute. So I think that Cambrian explosion that 142 talked about is already starting to happen, and the Discord hasn't even been killed.
That's right. I think that's exactly what we want to see. And so like leave Discord aside and look at like some of the other things that are happening in the space, right? Like you have teams like Agora or Brian who's building Discourse Killer. The subsidy directly affects them and their kind of ability to aggregate attention and brains around the projects that they're building. So, killing the Discord is actually really, really good for the builders in the community that are building kind of competing solutions, because ending the subsidy means that they'll get more business, right? And they have a higher probability of getting funded in the future. And it really just makes for a much healthier ecosystem in the long run.
If people want to get a hold of the Nounders, basically you go to the Discord now, right? With all the subsidies in different communities, where will that, I know you don't want to say the word central, but where would that place be where you can get a hold of all the Nounders and get that feedback still?
Yeah, that's a good question, and probably something we need to do some thinking about as a group. I know personally, I'm certainly committed to spending time making the rounds and visiting all of these communities that are popping up, which in some sense will make me kind of more accessible than in the quote unquote official Discord, where typically there's just so many things coming at me that I tend to avoid it as a space a little bit. I think us kind of continuing to kind of make the rounds, I think there's just a ton of value in having these conversations publicly, right? I think one of the biggest problems with the Discord is that we sort of silo a lot of the really interesting conversation that happens and forget about like the fact that there's a private channel in the Discord, but just the siloing of that conversation into the Discord itself means that there's tons of people on Twitter and Farcaster and other public platforms that like are just not going to see the information. So like if you tweet and you message me, I'm like, if you have something interesting to say on Twitter, I'll always respond. And when we have that conversation in public, there's just so many more people that will see it and benefit from it than otherwise.
Could you foresee a time where a Nouner call happens on like a Twitter Spaces?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a sense, there's one happening right now, right?
Yeah.
I think moving all of that conversation into public and moving it onto a platform where there's a kind of attention meritocracy. If you have a following that values what you have to say and you're hosting the space, everyone will listen to you. I think that is a very, very healthy thing. It moves the conversation into public, and it moves the conversation into a marketplace where the people who are kind of have the most interesting things to say are able to kind of aggregate a following. And I think that's just way healthier for the ecosystem.
Are you worried at all that the private conversations become even more private and the back rooms will get even darker at this point?
I mean, I think that's certainly a risk, but I think if the kind of cultural conventions in the community are to do things in public, I think that it will be a pretty strong forcing function around kind of what's considered acceptable in the community, right? So like the more things that happen in public and the more attention is aggregated in public and the more kind of thought leaders are public about their thoughts about nouns, like presumably there's some correlation with kind of opinions and votes that go along with those things, right? And so I think we can create kind of cultural norms around things happening in public such that backroom deals that make their way on chain are typically like voted down or kind of not looked favorably upon. I mean, I think there is some place for private conversations around sensitive issues. I don't know kind of how those work in the context of a DAO. I'd say almost every single instance of that we've seen in the history of the project has like been kind of more negative than positive. So it may well be the case that these organizations just work best when everything happens in public.
I'm curious too, like if you think any of the Nanish sub-DAOs and larger communities that may have a Discord or a central place where they are, if they should almost be like following suit as well and start following that trend of having these discussions in public, and maybe all team meetings are in public or something. I'm not sure if you think that should happen as quickly, or maybe should their audiences grow a little bit? I just wondered your personal thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I certainly think it doesn't hurt to do things in public. I think those kind of sub communities are different for the reason that they're not trying to kind of like impose like a totalitarian vision on the rest of the ecosystem, right? Like the fact that everyone just cares so much about what happens in the official space is the real problem. And once the space is unofficial, we can let the market decide. So, if it turns out that doing things in public kind of aggregates the most attention and creates the most value for the ecosystem, then presumably those spaces will win. And if it turns out that I'm wrong and doing things in private is more valuable, then those spaces will win. So I think that the benefit of again, it not having to come from like a place of central authority is that we can try all the methods and let the market decide what's best.
If we do lose the Discord, right, like it might just make things more private and less accountable too. It's something that I think, we don't want to rush into, but at the same time, I get the sense that everyone, there's a lot of big names in the Nouns community that's for this decision, and there's no real discussion about the potential negatives, and I think it's important to kind of get to both sides before we rush into something on this kind of topic.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm happy to talk about the other side. I certainly have spent a lot of time thinking about it too. I mean, and yeah, the consensus kind of point is an interesting one. Again, I think the only sort of defense against that happening is like a set of cultural norms, right? That like Nouns is about doing things in public, and that it becomes kind of like difficult to access the treasury via backroom dealings. Yeah, I mean, of course, some of the negatives are that the vibes are very good in the Discord, and we're not sure if those are going to be able to be recreated elsewhere, right? Like it could go wrong. It's possible that one of the things in crypto I think I've experienced over the years is that like it's always earlier than you think it is. I think probably like 5 years ago, I thought crypto was more mature as an ecosystem than I do now. And certainly to the extent that that's true for the Nouns ecosystem, like maybe it's too early to do this. It could well be the case that in the context of that earliness, like one of the things that people are buying into is like the community vibe, right? Like you could imagine that Noun prices go down significantly, to the extent that like people were buying Bored Apes because they got to go to Ape Fest. Maybe people were buying Nouns because they wanted to get into the Discord. All of that said, I think that ends up being like a very local maximum, right? And like in my mind, it is kind of more of a reason to move on from that phase of the history of the space and the project. If we're just selling like some analog to like Ape Fest concert tickets, like what are we even doing? And so again, I think those are some of the risks, right? Like number go down, attention go down, and maybe it's a bear market and the feedback loop doesn't cause it to recover. But I do think there's reason to be optimistic based on kind of the response we've seen so far.
Have you thought about timeline? Is this something that you're thinking will happen in days, weeks, months, or is that something that's still being discussed by Nounders?
Yeah, I mean, Nounders and I have been discussing this for a very long time. Like when was the right time? I think the place that we're in right now is probably weeks, but we're going to have another couple calls to discuss it and figure it out. I think that there's some level of like it being a bit suboptimal to indicate that it's going to happen and then leave the Discord kind of like lingering around, because there's an opportunity for, I don't know, people to oppose it. The people who oppose it to kind of engage in some FUD or use the end of the Discord as, like maybe the Discord post announcement has like some perverse set of incentives that we're not aware of, and it's bad for the project. So I think like ideally we archive the space, and ideally we don't like it doesn't get deleted without telling anyone, so that people can kind of like have some time to form other communities. But I think most of that can happen. Again, we're just creating Discord servers and like Farcaster and Twitter accounts. Like most of that can happen in a matter of like a week or two, and then we should move on from there.
The talk about archiving it, because I personally think there's a lot of value in keeping an archive of the Discord. I'm just curious if you've put much thought into how you would archive that, like in what format, or if, like do you build an exact clone of Discord that's non-functional, just like a read-only clone or something, or I've just been thinking about the different formats that it could be archived.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, like it's not my specialty, but I would assume that we can just set the permissions to read only and leave it read only for a while. And I don't know, maybe there are some kind of like internet archaeologists that want to kind of translate what is read only into kind of a more permanent form, whether that's screenshots or I don't know, IPFS or something like that. I mean, certainly everything that happened in there is probably not noteworthy, but there are some kind of sections that we want to keep. So I would think read only would kind of let anyone have an opportunity to do that. I think there's also some sense that like Discord is probably does not want to have that sort of like data persisting on their servers forever. So eventually I would expect that something would happen to it. So read only should give us like, months or years to kind of go in and say what we want in other places.
I was just curious, like, as we transition into these different places, if you have any thoughts or opinions on like what's a good type of place for us to go and talk about proposals. Like, does proposal talk move to a separate Discord? Does it move to do we use Discourse for that primarily moving forward, or if you had any opinion on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing that I think is kind of hopeful is like the Nouns AI team, maybe Joel Cares, maybe others that come along, like we'll now have a sort of marketplace to incentivize like inter-Discord or like inter-sub-DAO, inter-organizational communication. So it'd be very interesting if we saw some tools emerge for kind of like propagating those discussions kind of between spaces. Certainly, like the discourse is still there as a piece of kind of like centralized, quote unquote, official infrastructure. And I think it's probably too early to discontinue that. And of course, there's a whole kind of interesting conversation about the timing of kind of discontinuing any of these subsidies. But I think for now, like, discourse will be one of the places that happens naturally, which is probably good because the kind of like stateful and just, like slower nature of discussion that happens there is going to be useful. To the extent that people want more influence in the protocol, there are pretty strong incentives to build a really powerful Rocco, because that would be that would give you a lot of kind of power in the system, right? To be the one that is kind of like choosing how things propagate between the nodes, and eventually we'll probably see like even a plurality of those sorts of things. I hope that like what we're describing here really pertains primarily to the kind of social and communication layer, right? And then I think hopefully that's a bit of a forcing function to figure out how the governance structure can follow that same trajectory. Like maybe it becomes a norm that every one of these DAOs is made up of some manner of nounlets or little nouns. Or I think we do have to, in the longer term, figure out a way to kind of distribute the collateral so that it's like a little bit symmetrical, at least to the distribution of these communities.
Yeah, in Ugly DAO we have our fuglets as well.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, Ugly DAO is a perfect example of that, right? Ugly DAO is, I mean, whether or not it's a multi-sig or a DAO, it is its own sort of node in the system. And again, when you have an official space, one of the defining features of Ugly DAO is that that communication channel is not part of the official communication channel. But when you remove the official communication channel, the Ugly DAO gets elevated in a certain way, right? It is now equal to every other communication channel that happens in the space.
It's now officially ugly.
That's right. One final question for you, 41, from our Discord. Prof. Werder is asking, what is your big vision for Nouns, like 5, 10, 27 years down the road when there's 10K? What do you see as the big vision for Nouns?
I think the biggest vision is that it sort of becomes the governance layer of the metaverse, right? That like all of these different communities in the very long term sort of like coordinate the activities of the treasury, and it becomes a kind of like UN of the internet. And I think that would certainly be very cool, it may not occupy every single vertical, but for the verticals that it does occupy, and hopefully kind of public goods funding and infrastructure building is one of those, it's on the trajectory of being a kind of network state, or like a meta network state that is like, kind of the fabric that holds a bunch of these like specific Nounish states together. I think that's like the most exciting possible vision, and the boldest one I can think of, at least right now.
Do you have any thoughts on it replacing existing governance systems IRL, whether that's nations or local governments and things like that?
I mean, it's certainly possible. I think we probably have a lot of work to do before something like that is feasible. And I think it depends on a lot of factors kind of outside of the ecosystem as well. But, certainly I think we maybe can consider that a stretch goal.
Yeah.